morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is the High Dragon's Breath Bow Wow, welcoming you back to a new campaign of Arkan's Adversary, welcoming you to the Gates of Fire. New campaign time, new campaign time. Let's go. So, the overall request from our first and second campaign was more Marines, and specifically Marines fighting humans, as, to this point, we've only covered a couple of minor battles, only one of which has actually covered Space Marines at all. This campaign, however, is a lot. It is massive, spanning several planets, multiple subsectors, and is part of a much larger Crusade-sized force. Now, what Crusade could I be covering? This is an alt-canon, or realistically more of a filling in of canon Crusade. We will be covering many forces, but those involved have more rules, as this is again a canon-adjacent conflict. This has a couple of things that I need to note for this campaign. Now, the first and most obvious one will be if this is a alt-canon campaign or a filling in of blank spots campaign, the votes will be a little bit different. Obviously, we'll be talking about more discrete decisions. I'll be leaving more cliffhangers for you guys to vote on, specific, discrete things, rather than massive changes in the storyline, because, of course, there are certain things that need to occur, as this is a canon conflict. I have to live up to what Black Library has actually told me I'm allowed to write. But outside of that, you will still have every opportunity for input, for lore backgrounding, and for many other things. So, without further ado, as this is going to be a long one, sit back, grab your models, grab your headphones, grab a drink, and let's get right into it. Beginning with the past. And my crusade. Nadzibar, the Archon of the Blood Pact. Archon Nadzibar. Me. My crusade. Who is Nadzibar? That is to say, who am I? Well, I, am a descendant of the long series of events that have come from the violence of Saint Sabbat. Now, as a long descendant of the Saints' violence, I have several things a little bit different about me. And once again, thank you very much to Moritz for this lovely art. Now, what creates a creature like Nadzibar, a chaos-worshipping priest and disciple who has such a particular view of the universe and is so successful in combating the Imperium? Well, a lot of things, but in order to explain the current conflict and where this campaign begins, we have to go back in time. Long before my birth, long before Nadzibar or any people were really on the homeworld of the Blood Pact, that is Gura, we need to return to the primordial Sabbat worlds as they were before and to a degree during the Great Crusade and the Horus Heresy. This is a memory of Saint Sabbat's atrocities. Now, the saint, who was elected, or rather elevated, by the Emperor of Mankind to raise across the galaxy of the Sabbat worlds and to impose the Emperor's will upon those who live there, was merely a simple Chelon herdswoman, or herdsgirl, really, when she was elevated to the status of a living saint and given the inspiration to go forward and subjugate the worlds that now hold her name. We are in the far southwest of the galactic map, very close to absolutely nothing. Matter of fact, the Sabbat worlds are a pretty isolated area of space, but they are, nowadays, in the modern Imperium, quite populous. However, during the time that we're speaking of, during the Great Crusade, they are filled, not with Imperials, not with expansionists, but with a mix of empires. And the coming of the Saint, her awakening, and the arrival of reinforcements in the form of both Imperials in the proper sense, and also Space Marines in the sense of the White Angels, the White Scars in this case, this is the end of those empires. But who are these empires that had control of the Sabbat worlds long before the modern Imperium truly came into being? Well, they are a mixed bag. The Sabbat worlds are a very large area of space, and these empires come in many different flavors. Obviously, there are the classic versions, areas where humanity in their entirety are subjugated by Xenos or are in some way enslaved by psychic creatures of one kind or another. There are then independent human empires where one or many different human clans or groups lay control to entire sectors of space, or rather subsectors, and they have their own empires. And then finally, there is some of the most unique, and particularly the ones that are related to Nadzibar and to the Blood Pact, and those are the hybrid empires. Now, as for the pure human and the pure Xenos empires, there is both very little information, even in the historical record, and of course very little information as few of them actually survive. Some of them turn to the Saint and or are destroyed by her, others are simply killed outright in the case of the purely Xenos societies. However, these hybrid societies are one of the few that manage to resist the Saint. And the reason that they're able to do so is because they are already worshippers of chaos. They are worshippers long before the Emperor and truly the Crusade has even gotten going. They are a proto chaotic society. Effectively, a chaos-worshipping Xeno species keeps humans, or is in league with humans, who also worship the dark gods. Now again, this is an elementary form of chaos worship, where there is understanding of the warp through psychically attuned individuals, and occasionally through chaos corruption itself, and so worship is developed as a result of it. These are tribalist beliefs, very simplistic, very elementary, and quite different from what we apply to a lot of other chaos theology in the modern day. Much of modern chaos theology is created or really modified as a result of the outcome of the Great Crusade and the Horus Heresy. The Primarchs and the various conflicts that occurred therein have had a marked effect upon chaos worship within much of chaotic society. The Sabbat worlds are completely and utterly removed from this development. They were worshipping chaos long before any other society was, save for those around the Eye of Terror itself, such as the Colchizians. This, as a result, means that these blended empires already had the blessing of the Dark Gods when they were met with Saint Sabbat. And as you might expect, an Imperial Saint meeting genuine Chaos worshippers resulted in absolute and abject slaughter. The Saints' Crusade, as it came to be known, is one of the most violent acts of genocide ever brought about in the entirety of the 41st millennium, or at the time, technically, it would have been the 35th or 36th millennium. And, of course, a big part of this was her bringing of the angels. The angels, in this case, being basically the entirety of the White Scars. Masses of white-clad angelic figures became recognized even long afterward in the writings of these proto-human Xenos empires as demons, as genuine living embodiments of a god that hated and went against the ruling of chaos. Now, the bringing of these angels was not alone. The saint herself did a great deal of damage. The destruction of worlds, both from exterminatus, planets that were too corrupted and as a result were purged by the saint in her crusade, and then of course others that were so completely ruined by warfare that they could not be regained. Finally, there was another considerable problem, which is planets that had been bathed in the light of the warp, either by the red radiation that marks the sanguinary worlds that Gura is a part of, or simply planets where chaos worship had taken such a long time to develop that the corruption had sunk into the very ecology and society therein. Upon being exposed to the imperial faith, to a true imperial saint in many cases, a living saint, giving off the actual power of the emperor himself, their entire society, and including their ecology, would simply collapse. Plants would cease to grow. Air would flee the planet. Corruption of all kinds fell apart, and it left many planets simply dead, empty husks, no longer able to support the life that once thrived there. This social and ecological collapse, along with the violence of the angels, resulted in one of the largest mass genocides as mentioned in basically all of the 41st millennium's history. Over a relatively short period of time, these multiple empires of tens of billions, if not hundreds of billions, of humans and Xenos were completely wiped out and driven before the Saint into the absolute backwater of their realms. Forced to either collaborate or die, their end, or rather the end of the Saints' Crusade, did indeed end with a technical victory, but it was one that truly did deny anyone any sense of true victory or defeat. The Saint herself was killed. The method is something that we will go into later. It's a bit of a complex subject, one that I've spent a lot of time researching. As you might imagine, as the Archon, I do worry about the Saint. But this denial of reprisal, the fact that those empires have become so mixed and homogenized and so few in number and had so few worlds left to command, when the Saint, and thus the impetus from the Crusade, bled out into the warp, well, there was no ability to have a reprisal. There was no getting back at the Imperials. Society, life as we knew it in what was the Sabbat worlds and what then became the Imperial Sabbat worlds, was no more. And as a result of that, it was not a true defeat. It left many, many, many bits of those empires still around. Whether it was chaos corruption within the Sabbat worlds, whether it was individual sects or societies like the Gurans who happened to escape to an, at the time, uninhabited and wastelandish planet in order to develop over really tens of thousands of years. But over that period of time, there was no way to get back at the Imperium, so it left a severe bitterness in the mouths of these, well, many generations of individuals. The response is probably expected. This injustice could not stand. It may have stood for a millennium, it may have stood for 6,000 years, but for however long it took, there had to be something of a reprisal. There had to be revenge for this ultimate injustice. This God that had come and taken away the empire of our forefathers has to be met in battle and defeated completely. And as a result, Nadzabur rises. Thousands of years after the end of the Saints' Crusade, a feral world warlord is killed, and his position as leader of a sect of martial brotherhood priests, the Blood Pact, is usurped by his own priest, Nadzabur. Now, Nadzabur is an old man by the time that he actually takes charge of the Blood Pact. However, as an old man, he is cunning and incredibly, incredibly good at several different things, one of which is diplomacy. Now, you might not expect a chaos worshipper on a feral world to be incredibly talented at diplomacy, and yet this individual seems to cut against the grain. What is more, he has a very deep understanding of, really, his society's history. He understands the Saints' Crusade in a way that the average contemporary does not. He knows about this need for reprisal, about the denial of true victory that they had taken from them so many centuries ago. And so, he begins his crusade. The start point of the crusade is the year 600 Millennium 41. Now again, if you'll remember, the Saints' Crusade is almost 5,000 years ago. It's been a long-standing grudge. But at the year 600, what do they really have? Gura is a complete backwater. It lacks any void-capable craft, it lacks any complex or sophisticated government, and it's really just a very simplistic feral world warband situation where people kind of worship chaos, but it's not exactly as refined or dictated as actual religion. That's all going to change. Over a relatively short period of time, roughly 100 or so years, that is going to be completely different, flipped on its head. But let's start at the very beginning. The start point at 600 Millennium 41, at the start point, we have Nadzabur gaining control of Gura. Then the active invasion begins. This invasion is perpetrated by a mix of different forces that Nadzibar manages to ensnare over the next 35 years, basically. This active invasion gives him the ability to overtake each individual imperial stronghold within the Sanguinary Worlds, his actual domain, very close to his homeworld of Gura. However, the current year, aka the time period where we'll be having this crusade or this adversaries campaign, is another 45 years later at 680 Millennium 41. Now, that time jump is very significant. This invasion has taken many worlds, and the Blood Pact and their allies in what is called the Zhou Sanguinary, or the Sanguinary Brotherhood, have expanded far beyond the original corner of the Sabbat worlds that they belonged in, and have both taken planets and completely surrounded other sectors. They are well on the way, in fact, to actually overwhelming the Imperial governance and pushing them far, far away from their own homeworlds. Now, this is still an active invasion, and his crusade, so to speak, is still being actively protected against by the Imperium of Man, but they are no longer so sure of victory. What they had assumed in the year 600 to be a mild increase in the amount of piracy, and what by 635 they were realizing had been maybe a bit of a concerning loss of territory in the Sanguinary Worlds and the adjoining subsectors, has now, by the year 680, become a genuine invasion. Dozens of worlds have been completely lost. Many have completely gone over to the side of chaos, beginning to produce weaponry, equipment, and even vessels for the Zhou Sanguinary. These magisters and their archon have managed to actually overwhelm several of the defensive positions that the Sabbat worlds as a whole had been expecting to rely on in case of a chaotic attack. But of course, they had not expected a chaotic attack from within. What does that attack look like? Well, outside of the Cabal Group, there are several different factions. Just going over this map here, in the top right-hand corner, you have the Sanguinary Worlds. This is a warp-bathed area of space, where Gura is in the very top right-hand corner, and several other Imperial worlds are within this area. This whole sector, or subsector rather, is seized by the Blood Pact by the year 635, and there's expansion into the following areas. But let's start with factions. We have the Blood Pact. The Blood Pact are pretty much the poster boys for the Sabbat Worlds Crusade. They are Nadzibar's personal army. They are the martial religious brotherhood that is most related to the Sabbat Worlds as a whole. They are, again, the remnant or a long, distant relation to those original combination chaos-worshipping and Xenos chaos-worshipping proto-empires that had been most successful in fighting against the Saint. But the Blood Pact are a martial brotherhood from a feral world. They are big, they are brawny, they are a little bit dull on occasion, but they've had time to modernize over the intervening 80 years, basically. And they, of course, are led by myself, Archon Nadzibar. The next up is the Vehedwak. Now, the Vehedwak is a Gurin word that generally just means pirates, or really means free raider, but pirate, essentially, is the best term for it. They are led by Rushek Vakim. Rushek Vakim, colloquially referred to as the Lightning Lord, is a bit of an oddment. Now, the Vehedwak as a whole are a combination of different things. They are a mix of traitor Imperial Navy ships that have been picked up by the Blood Pact for various reasons. Either their captains were able to be bribed, tricked, or intimidated into joining the Zhou Sanguinary, or, like in the case of Vakim himself, he is simply acting as a mercenary for the Zhou Sanguinary as a whole. A professional Navy man in the heart of a chaos force. A very odd faction there, but they are definitely more space-based. You'll notice that a lot of the ones that we'll be talking about are space-based, start out as pirates. The next one up is the Gutothraka, also referred to as the Thorns of Heaven, led by Nokad the Blighted. Now, Nokad the Blighted has a bit more detail to him. The man is very old, a worshipper of both the god of plague and the god of pleasures. He is a, let's say, split personality leader. And he has many different things, arguably wrong with him, but for all the sloppiness and messiness of the methods that he uses to succeed in conflict, he is still very successful. And he brings with him one of the most powerful allies that the Pact have, pound for pound, which is he's a direct ally with the Dark Tusks warband. Now, the Dark Tusks are not Plague Marines. Yet, or not entirely. They are, however, essentially Black Legionaries who worship Nurgle, and they have been expelled from the Black Legion for their unique worship of Nurgle alone, and also for the personal ambitions of their leader, Ratan Marus. Now, the Dark Tusks are allies with the Guthathraka because it is to their benefit. They don't want to have to deal with mortal conflicts or sustaining themselves. Allying with the Jo Sanguinary, a force that is on the rise in the Sabbat worlds, makes a ton of sense to them. And of course, they will be in this campaign featuring heavily because the Thorns of Heaven will be here as well. Finally, we have possibly one of the largest and most dangerous naval forces, where the Vahedwalk are a mixture of ex-naval and reorganized naval troops, and the Guthathraka are a more traditional chaotic force, very reticent of true chaos pirates. The Charismites are a little bit of something in between. Not quite traitor mercenary and not quite chaos worshipper. They are more the chaos army. They are an organized and structured and regulated navy. A true navy built on the same lines as the Imperial Navy, and yet not made from naval officers. They have been one of the longest standing allies of the Pact, led by their leader, Cabal, the Red Hand, a very famous Charismite leader who is featured in many different engagements so far. They also boast one of the largest navies in the entirety of the Jo Sanguinary, and they are one of the few who will boast genuine capital ships throughout the entirety of this conflict. However, they have other things to do. The campaign has expanded beyond the Sanguinary worlds into the Carcharodon's cluster, which is nearby. Now, the Carcharodon's cluster is a very important location. It is go-between for several different sectors, including the Rimward Marginals, the Sabbat sector, the Northern sector, the Iranians group, and the Cabal Group. Now, our focus for this campaign is the Cabal Group. However, that's not where the Charismites are. The Charismites are pushing onward into the Sabbat worlds, specifically into the Sabbat subsector up here in the center middle. It is one of the most prosperous and important sectors, and for that reason the largest navy is required in order to ensure its conquest. Nadzbar himself will likely also be deploying there in addition, while other forces of the Pact and other troops in general have been heading in all different directions, but we'll go over that in a bit. Then, of course, for our subsectors, just to highlight our map here, because we'll be using it pretty heavily, the Sanguinary worlds are right here, marked with an SW. The Carcharodon's cluster is right here, CC. The Rimward Marginals are this little spot here. The Rimward Marginals are really, really far away. They're honestly one of the most western sections of the entirety of the Imperial map. It is a long journey to get there, and there's not much out there, just a couple of planets and a very, very large ship graveyard. So yeah, it's not a very important sector. There's basically no Imperial presence there whatsoever. Down here, this kind of curved subsector here, we have the Iranians group. The Iranians group, a little bit like the Carcharodon's cluster, it's a big go-between area between the Khan group, the Core group, and the rest of the Sabbat worlds. Then we have the Cabal Group, which is the focus of our campaign. It is kind of the iron heart of the Sabbat worlds, one of the most heavily defended and honestly most difficult to get into because there's only one way in and out, and that is located in the Carcharodon's cluster. But we will get to that in a bit. Then we have the Northern Sector, or the Northern Group. That is just the section that is further into Segmentum Tempestus. So it goes northward in this map. Again, think of the map as a little bit sideways. To your right is north, and then to your up is west, essentially. Then we have Nizen's Triangle, the Newfound Trailing Group, and the Menezoid Clasp. All of them are on the southern side of the map, in this case on the left side, and they represent some of the newer or more freshly developed planets, not so ancient and poorly maintained as the ones nearer to the Sanguinary worlds. And then, of course, we have the Khan Group and the Sabbat sector. Now, the Sabbat subsector and the Khan Group are two of the most important sectors of the Sabbat worlds. The Sabbat subsector, of course, bears the saint's name. It has many holy worlds of hers. It has a lot of shrine worlds. It has many capital worlds. The Khan Group would not be as important as it is if it did not have the actual planetary, or rather, sector governance. The government for the entire Sabbat worlds is located in the Khan Group on a planet called Karn Nobilis, and we will get to that at some point. But right now, the campaign, and in fact the Crusade, is expanding into, I think, 6 different sectors at once. The Rimward Marginals, the Sabbat sector, we've already taken much of the Carcharodon's cluster, we're heading into the Irani's group and the Northern sector at the same time, and now this campaign is our entry into the Cabal Group. Now again, important disclaimer. There's a reason why I'm going over all of this. One, it's good background for the campaign. I have to explain how things are going. There are other factions that we could talk about. We could talk about the Heritors, who are on the planet of Solipsis. We could talk about the Kith, who are on Gehenna. We could talk about all different types of cults that are involved in the Zhou Sanguinary later, but I'm just highlighting the most important ones that you need to know at the moment. But why am I even talking to you about this? If I'm going into a crusade, why is there nobody writing about this? Why is there no Black Library novel on this? Well, very simply, we know absolutely nothing about the original crusade. The entirety of the Sabbat Worlds, or the Gaunt's Ghosts series, as much as I love it, pays absolutely no attention to what was going on before the crusade that goes into retaking the Sabbat Worlds. So, obviously, if they are retaking the Sabbat worlds, how did they get taken in the first place? We don't know. We just have a period of time from X to Y where Nadzibar is essentially running roughshod over the imperial governments to the point where the government actually gives up. They remove the Civitas Imperium from the entirety of the Sabbat worlds, literally giving up control of the sector and calling it quits. They stop resisting the Chaos Forces at a certain point, and that has basically never happened before in the entirety of 40k. Never before has the government of the Imperium, imperial bureaucrats, willingly said, I give up to the archenemy. Never has it ever happened that Abaddon's Black Crusades, or the Lacerators' Crusade, or even Lufthoron were given because they had beaten the Imperials to the point where they could no longer feasibly resist. Now, I think that that's a very worthy thing to write a story about, and in this case, to record a video about. And if you agree with me, feel free to keep watching. Let's go ahead. Let's focus in on the Cabal Group real quick. This is the bolt hole of the Sabbat worlds, and after the post-Carcharodon's jump-off, which is illustrated here, you can see coming out of the Sanguinary worlds the Blood Pact and their allies, going into the Carcharodon's cluster, and then popping out like an infection going to every single other sector. They penetrate into the Northern sector, into the Irani's group, into the Sabbat subsector, into the Rimward Marginals. Out of Carcharodon's, having a couple of production worlds like Solipsis, having many planets from which to draw population, this nasty combination of people, machinery, and production allows them to basically double the size of everyone's actual military, and each of these individual factions of pirates, chaos cultists, warriors, feral world elites break out on their own individual assignments, essentially leapfrogging over each other to get from world to world, conquering each one as they go, and then turning them right around. Now, it's not always conquering them with months-long campaigns or violence. Many of these planets aren't prepared for this scale of invasion. It was never expected. The Sanguinary worlds were beyond not a threat. Remember, until a couple decades ago, Gura didn't even have spaceflight, and they were struggling to smith steel. It only took them a couple of decades and some help from the Charismites to actually get into a position to conquer not only their subsector, but the neighboring ones as well. And now that they've drawn all these allies, this leapfrog tactic that Nadzbar has cooked up begins. One naval force followed by an army force, another naval force behind them. Every single time they run into an opponent or an Imperial picket fleet, they have another fleet to push past them and attack another target. This keeps the Imperials horribly tied up. They have no idea where the Blood Pact or the Zhou Sanguinary as a whole are going to strike next, and as a result of poor communication, poor military leadership, and absolutely abysmal military readiness, the Carcharodons are completely rolled, and the crusade of Nadzabars gets to move onward into the other sectors. However, you will notice that there is a distinct lack of any movement into the Cabal Group. There's a reason for that. It is a bolt hole. It is incredibly well defended, and it is designed like a castle, or really a Mott and Bailey castle. It has a much weaker outer defense, and then it has a much stronger inner defense that is probably one of the most difficult to break into locations in the entirety of the Sabbat Worlds, and we'll go over that later in the campaign. The outer defenses themselves are pretty formidable. There's an Imperial picket fleet on the very outside, on the side of the Carcharodons cluster where the crusade from Nadzabar has been coming into. However, this picket fleet could be overcome by the Chaos Forces. What couldn't be overcome is what happens if they tried to warp jump into the Cabal Group. There is an entire sector battle fleet just waiting on the other side of the Cabal warp jump point, just waiting for anything to come through. And in addition to that, there are multiple space stations also waiting at the jump point. And in addition to that, there is planetary artillery on a world called Vandamar that overlooks the warp jump point to a degree. Essentially, if anything tried to go way far past or do an emergency jump to the nearest land station, they would find Vandamar, which is very well armed and has orbital weaponry. However, that's not the only dangerous thing that's in the Cabal Group, and it's not the only reason that up to this point, the Zhou Sanguinary have left well enough alone. The biggest problem is the number of Adeptus Astartes deployed to the Cabal Group. It is a training ground for over 3 chapters of Marines that add 700 plus Astartes to the defense. Now that's not 700 Marines in training, that's not 700 Marines in theory. That is 700 true blue, God's honest truth, Adeptus Astartes. This is split between, as I said, 3 different chapters. The Silver Guard, who make up a very significant portion of the actual defenders, the Iron Snakes, who make up a slightly smaller percentage, and then the White Scars, who make up only a little bit less than the Silver Guard. Now, each of these have multiple companies deployed to the Cabal Group, for a mix of reasons. On the one hand, they use it as a defensive position from which to theoretically sally out and attack anything like what is happening in the entirety of the Crusade right now. However, they've been tied up. There's a bit of a problem. These Chaos Worshippers have a relatively large navy, and that navy prevents a lot of Marine light cruisers and other vessels from leaving without Imperial naval support. And as I said, the Imperial Navy is ridiculously tied up. They are refusing, and in many cases being ordered to not leave the planets that they are defending, because if they left them for even a couple of months, or God forbid up to a year, there's a pretty solid chance that a massive Chaos army is going to drop down onto that planet's doorstep, and without orbital defenses, or without naval support, they will lose yet another world. Sector governance is absolutely refusing to allow any naval vessels to leave the Cabal Group. They cannot afford to lose the valuable resources and the valuable troops that have been brought into this bolt hole and essentially sealed in. So for this reason, as much as the Marines would love to sally forth and attack the Chaos Worshippers, doing so would be suicide, considering that their vessels would be so unbelievably outnumbered and outgunned that they would likely die before they managed any effective attacks. So, what else is in here with them, or rather stuck in here with them? Well, a couple of regiments. We have the Fantine Skyborn. They are not the most elite regiment, they are a jump regiment in the most traditional of terms, only because Fantine has a particular affinity with jump technology and with jetpacks in general. They are, however, not an incredibly wealthy hive world, and while they have a significant amount of production, they are only able to raise 2 regiments of Fantine Skyborn, one of which stays on their planet to assist the PDF. The largest deployment of regiments in the entirety of the Cabal Group is from the Kalian Lancers. Often referred to as Wallmen, they are primarily deployed in the inner sector, the Iron Heart of the Cabal system, that upper Mott and Bailey part of the Mott and Bailey Castle. There are 32 total Kalian Lancer regiments, and they specialize in a mix of artillery and defensive static warfare. They are quite resilient fighters. Then we have 3 Urdeshi regiments, a combination of heavy mechanized and heavy armored regiments, along with some regular mechanized, so 3 total. 1 regiment from Kilgrave, so Kilgrave is the capital of the Iranis group, and it is a big ship-producing world. The regiment from Kilgrave is mostly there as a defensive measure for some of the bigger investments of, like, naval supplies. So some of the armory worlds that are holding a lot of macro cannon shells or missiles or fuel, they're protected by the Kilgrave troops because that equipment is assembled on Kilgrave, and as a result, they are protecting it. And in addition, of course, to those regiments, there are millions of PDF troops. Significant numbers here, especially when buoyed up with 700 plus Space Marines and the defensive works that exist within the Cabal Group. However, as mentioned, there are 2 sections to the Cabal Group. There is the soft subsector, which is the northern one here. You can see bathed in the warp, essentially, influence of Gilliman's Sinkhole, which is a real space abjuration that essentially spills a bunch of warp energy, kind of like the Eye of Terror, further north towards this sector, or subsector. This is the first circle up here to the northern side, and within it there are 4 primary worlds. We have Anothis, which is the main target of this campaign, or at least the first target. Its main advantages are that it is one of the only hive worlds within the Cabal Group, and it has the highest population and also some of the most food production amongst all of the Cabal Group worlds. Now, there's a major downside to that food production, we'll talk about it in a bit, but that population is used by almost every other planet. It is used to shore up working populations, it's used on contracts. Matter of fact, it is more common on Anothis for an individual accused of a crime to be offered a job off-world than it is for them to actually be imprisoned, because their population is more useful as laborers than they are as prisoners, even if they are criminals. Vandamar, as we mentioned before, is the bypassed armory. It is a storage for shells, in addition to being the cap on the metaphorical defenses of the external and internal way into the Cabal Group. Essentially, that warp jump point is protected by both a battle fleet and space stations and Vandamar's own weaponry. However, it may come into play later, as though it's an armory world and quite well defended, much like Vrax was, it is a storage for shells and guns, and ammunition is of a great importance when you're talking about attacking something like the Cabal Group. Then we have 2 slightly less important worlds, well, arguably less important, depending on who you are. We have Gurion. Gurion is a mining world, much like Lugnum, which we've already gone over. It produces a great deal of raw material, but it has a very, very small population, and it has pretty rough working conditions as well. We'll go into that more during other parts of this campaign. Finally, in this subsector, we have Fantine. Fantine is an industrial world, a pretty important one. However, the runoff and really the pollution from their industry has caused them to live in very, very high hive worlds, or hive cities rather, placed on top of mountains to keep them out of the smog and pollution that basically consumes the entirety of the planet's surface. However, due to the fact that they live so far above the surface and do some modifications in the gravity and travel and such, they are really adept at producing aircraft. They have their own planetary air forces. They produce aircraft of various types for the Imperium, usually of a local pattern. There are several different ones, some of which the Blood Pact have actually managed to get their hands on already. The Fantine Black Viper, which is another air superiority craft. But this industrial world is also a hive world, so slightly lower population than Anothis, but it is also much more polluted, and you really can't exist upon its surface. That's it for the soft subsector. What about the hardened subsector? Well, it's the southern one, and it is far more defended. This little diamond pattern is actually a completely ridiculous-sized naval minefield. It is basically almost a light year in length, with multi-layered automated torpedoes designed to destroy any ship that tries to penetrate it. Now, in addition to this, one might immediately think, what about warp jumping through it? Well, that's where Gilliman's sinkhole and the various other warp disturbances in the Cabal Group come into play. There are multiple star fortresses that make up the tip of each of these locations, and due to warp interference, one of the only places that you can actually travel through the warp and accurately find yourself consistently is right at one of those Ramillies-class star fortresses. AKA, if you're an enemy, you're probably going to die, even if you bring capital ships. So trying to penetrate through the minefield via using the warp isn't an option. What about penetrating through the minefield directly? Well, I hope you enjoy getting hit by about 9 sets of torpedoes before you can even make it through the minefield itself. Not to mention that you're not going to be sneaky. There are multiple scout craft that constantly orbit sections of this minefield, protecting and making sure that any fleets that want to travel through there are monitored and taken care of. The only easy way to bypass these minefields is to go right past the star fortresses, which, again, as we are a Chaos Force and pretty obviously an enemy, good luck. But, as mentioned, that's the far more defended area. We'll talk about that later. So, our target, Enothis. As expected, we will be starting with our first planet that the Chaos Forces try to make landing on. And they have to make landing in a very specific manner. Deception. Now, this deception bypassing of Vandemar for Enothis is with purpose. We have an individual leading this section of the Crusade who hasn't really seen a lot of life so far. Enoch Innocenti. Now, those of you who are familiar with the Gaunt's Ghost series may have heard Innocenti's name before. He is actually one of those individuals who fought with the Saint personally, man-to-man. However, we are a far way off from that fateful fight, and Enoch has quite a bit to do. He's been, let's not say lazy, but rather held back as a rear guard. Essentially, if the Imperials actually did manage to organize a spearhead to try and attack the Sanguinary Worlds or the Carcharodon's cluster directly, it would be Enoch's job to play goalie effectively. However, with the Crusade going absolutely swimmingly and with the Navy seemingly paralyzed, Enoch is taking the opportunity to roll the dice on taking the Cabal cluster, or Cabal Group as a whole. And his plan is infiltration. Now, why Enothis? Well, he's managed to capture something, or more realistically, he's managed to bargain for something. An Ambition-class cruiser that had belonged to a rogue trader, in addition to a large convoy of rogue trader-related ships. The Ambition-class cruiser, a Sword-class escort, 5 normal freighters, and 2 heavy freighters. Using this little mini convoy, they pose as a rogue trader caravan, carrying food and requesting safe haven from the pirates that have become the vanguard of the Chaos Crusade. Essentially, he pretends, or rather, he has the vessel that he's now taking care of pretend that they are simply rogue traders seeking to flee from the Chaos forces. And even after checking out, and the full search is done, every single one of these vessels is fully searched, but there is no indication of any funny business. The writ of trade is there, and it is in one piece. The rogue trader himself is not to be found, but that's not too abnormal. The second-in-command for the vessel is still there, and he's perfectly happy to show them everything that they want to see. And what is even more interesting is, even though these inspectors are walking right past a bunch of Bloodpact troops, they don't know it, because these Bloodpact troops are fresh, and they've been raised from a lot of captured troops taken during the invasion of the Carcharodon's Carcharodon's cluster. That means that they are pretty much converted Imperials, with very little chaos corruption, if any, having just retrained themselves on Gura and now acting as Pact Sons. Now, this go over obviously doesn't go through every single part of the ship, and thus anyone who cannot pass as normal hides deep within the within the bilges of the vessels, or in cold storage. Either way, these fake rogue traders manage to pass through and come within spitting distance of Enothis. Now, the 7 freighters are permitted to land. Of course, Enothis, being a planet that produces food, why do they need food? Well, being the fact that they have all this production, it's being absolutely scalped by the rest of the Cabal Group. Now, Cabal is likely going to be under siege. Every single planet, especially the more important ones than Enothis, are trying to take in as many provisions as they possibly can. Enothis, for the first time in possibly its entire history, cannot keep up with the amount of demand for its planetary supply. Even though the tithe is a bit of an absolute nightmarish mess because of this chaos invasion, they are finding themselves habitually behind the curve and having more and more difficulty making it up and getting enough food to feed their own population along with the entire needs of the rest of the Cabal Group. As a result, rogue traders offering multiple freighters worth of food are a welcome sight, and they are permitted down. At least all of the non-combat ships are permitted down without much of a fuss. So, the 7 freighters land within the primary spaceport of the capital hive of Enothopolis. I know, a very unimaginative name. I wish that wasn't actually the canon name. It actually is. So, these freighters arrive, dropping down into the primary spaceport of Enothopolis, and they are weighed down not by food, as one might expect, but by a mixed Chaos and Blood-Pact assault force. Now, who is defending Enothis? If we've brought these forces here, I've added a little detail here, a little bit more detail on Gilliman's Sinkhole, on the radiation of chaos that is bathing Enothis and making it such a good growing season all the time. Vandamar, Gurion, Fantine, and then down here we have Morlond, Monthax, and Jago. Jago and Morlond are both fortress worlds. Monthax is an uninhabited webway gate. And then you can see the kind of barbed wire marking for the space fortresses and the minefield here. Just a little map there. Who's defending Enothis? Well, couple of different things split up amongst different groups. As you can imagine, Enothis is basically entirely garrisoned by space marines. Well, you might not imagine that. Well, that's because Enothis is pretty special. It is one of the primary locations used for training because, as you saw from the map, it has some absolutely wild topography. Mountains, oceans, multiple different types of seas, islands, rivers, more mountains, more deserts, different types of plains and plateaus, many different topographical features that Marines need in order to effectively train both their new recruits and their converted, lower recruits. Who is directly standing in the way, however, of the Blood Pact and their combined forces at Enothopolis? Well, the Hive world itself, the northern Hive city as it were, has a population of 3 billion. It is a traditional spire hive with everything that you would expect from a fairly standard Imperial hive. Orbital defenses, communications, astropaths, storage, industry, all that kind of stuff, in addition to a lot of agriculture as previously mentioned. It is defended by a rather paltry force of about 30,000 enforcers. Now, these enforcers are effectively acting as a faux PDF. They're not nearly well as armed. They're much more accurately related to something like local police. Weaponry-wise, they're probably only looking at pistols, maybe a couple of non-lethal weapons, possibly a couple of stun weapons. That could be reasonable for them, but a majority of them basically never have to go into actual combat because the city is also garrisoned by 75 White Scars brothers of the 8th Brotherhood. Essentially, the lion's share of the 8th company of the White Scars chapter is currently located and training on Enothis, and they act as both the planet's defenders and an ability to put down any forces that want to try and cause an uprising on this lovely planet. As one would expect, 75 Marines is massive overkill for any type of planetary cult. However, as you're about to see, it's not nearly enough to deal with an actual Chaos invasion from outside, and certainly not one that got this close without getting noticed. The Southern Hive, also known as the Trinity Hives, it is essentially a triple spire Southern Hive down here, has another population of 3 billion, and a similar defense force of 30,000 enforcers and 75 silver guards. Now, the silver guards are from the 10th company, definitely the training company, the least elite of their force. The silver guards have shipped out for a lot of different locations as they commit a very large portion of their chapter to protecting the Cabal Group. But this individual group has stayed on Anothis as they are a training regiment, or rather a training company in many cases, and they have a lot of scout marines and other forces like that. But they are still in larger numbers when compared to the last city, which isn't actually one city. It is 7 cities split up amongst the central sea of Anothis, or rather the seas. These have another collective population of about 3 billion divided by 7. The total population of Anothis, as a result, is around 9 billion, maybe a little bit higher, as there are many different diffuse farming communities and places like that along the ocean. And they are defended by 35,000 enforcers, so a few more enforcers, as one would expect, as it's 7 different cities. And then 50 Iron Snakes Marines, with Brother Captain Phaeus of the 9th Company. Now, this is half a company. A majority of the Iron Snakes are probably elsewhere, and they will feature later in the actual Gaunt's Ghosts end of the Imperial Crusade. But for the moment, a rather small portion, or rather half of the 9th Company, is within the Cabal Group and currently unable to leave all that easily. So, a couple of economic, cultural, and topographical notes about it. As we've talked about, this difficult terrain on Anothis is ideal for training. In addition to that, it is in that warp Goldilocks zone, where Gilliman's Sinkhole, this massive warp aberration that makes travel within the Cabal Group and around the Cabal Group and into the hardened area of the Cabal Group, so gosh darn squirrely and difficult, spills out a massive wave of essentially chaos radiation, much like what the Sabbat worlds have, or what the Sanguinary worlds have with their red suns and their red radiation. The warp energy that spills out of Gilliman's Sinkhole affects Anothis directly. However, unlike many other worlds, it does not cause rampant mutation and violence within the population. Rather, it is in a Goldilocks zone, where it is just powerful enough to affect the plants and the living creatures, causing it to yield great amounts of crops and massive bumper crops without having any true chaos corruption in them, but it is not enough to cause unrest. There is a little bit more aberrant DNA in the population. There are many mutants or those types of individuals, but as the Space Marines are the one taking care of any duty or culling that needs to be done, it's really never been a problem. Before now. However, the big issue, or the big next thing for that is, of course, the real problem on Anothis, and why the ruse that Enoch Inokenti cooks up actually succeeds. Their food production is running out. The siege of Cabal, this cut off of the Imperial tithe, and no other ships being able to enter or leave this sector of space because of the chaos blockade of the one and only entrance into the Cabal system, or the Cabal Group, has made it so that Anothis is strapped for food. They are essentially sending off more than 80% of all of what they produce, making it very, very difficult for them to afford to feed their own population. And this is drawing their strategic reserves dangerously low, which is why not only Vandemar allows these ships to come through, but also the ships are accepted down to the surface as quickly as possible to get food out of them and into storage. There is some consideration or concern that this rogue trader's crop might be negatively affected by staying in the warp for too long. So, what about on the other side? We've talked about what's in Enothopolis, about 75 White Scars Marines, and then 30,000 or so enforcers. What's coming in from these forces secreted aboard the freighters? Well, from the freighters safely landed on Anothis, we have 50,000 Pack Suns. Now, I haven't introduced Pack Suns on the channel all that directly, but they are at this point in their kind of second generation. They have developed significantly beyond the feral world martial brotherhood that they were before the actual crusade began, and they are much better armed and particularly armored armored than their fellow cultists. They have universally automatic autoguns, either of Gurin pattern, which is a 4570 AK if you want a reference, or of other patterns that all have access to fully automatic fire. They universally wear some form of body armor, whether it be 25mm steel plates and helmets, like this gentleman has down here, or genuine flak armor in many cases, and they also universally have access to either a particular melee weapon or a large bayonet. So this is a force that uses a combination of melee combat and ranged combat, and they are very much geared towards quick assault, towards medium fortified positions at this point, because of course you have to remember this is Enoch's back guard. These are the individuals who aren't on the direct front lines all the time, and they are freshly raised from a lot of Imperial prisoners in many cases. So they are not as veteran as their fellows, but there are veterans amongst them. And so they are for assaulting lighter positions and for attacking in large, very violent groups. In addition to the melee weapons, they also have scattered heavy weapons. Now, these are a mix of stolen autocannons from various ships and heavy bolters a vast majority of the time, though some of them do have shot cannons as well. These are not universal for every squad, but you could argue that perhaps there will be a heavy weapon for every 25 men, roughly. So every platoon or two is going to have access to a heavy weapon. And in addition to that, about 10k of them, about 1/5 of them, are fully motorized. They have enough vehicles and enough motorized vehicles to transit themselves. These are not necessarily armed, but many of them are armed with either a mix of heavy stubbers, medium stubbers, or heavy bolters in some cases. A lot of these are Steg 4s, some of them are trucks, others of them are N20s, but there are very few of those heavier vehicles. These are mostly motorized, mostly trucks and jeeps and things of that nature, but they are in large numbers. In addition to them, you have a much more elite troop. Basically, one of the most elite troops that are available to the Chaos Forces in this campaign. 5,000 Death Brigadiers. Now, Death Brigadiers have a particular title. They are diehards. They are Pact Sons who act as the personal guards of the Archon. They are Nadzibar's personal protectors. Usually, they are about 10,000 strong at their absolute weakest. They have increased and decreased in number over time, but in this case, these 5,000 were left behind to protect Gura itself. Now, technically, again, Enoch is bending the rules here by bringing my personal bodyguards out to go on an offensive. However, this does technically protect the Sanguinary Worlds, as in theory, these Marines could still try and break out of the Cabal sector, or the Cabal Group, in order to try and attack us. So, theoretically, he's not breaking the rules too much by bringing the Death Brigade out, but they are about as well led and as difficult to break as you would imagine. They are 5,000 of the most elite troops available to the Zhou Sanguinary, completely willing to give their lives in any and all circumstances for the accomplishing of their mission. They do not break, they do not run. In fact, it could be quite arguable that they know as little fear as the Space Marines do. And in addition to that, as one might expect, they are incredibly well armed. They have almost universally las guns, and quite a few of them have either special melee weapons or heavy weapons. Now, these special melee and heavy weapons, they range from power weapons, very rarely, but there are a couple of them, especially for commanders. They have a lot of chain weapons, quite common, in fact. One or two per every platoon would not be unreasonable. Heavy weapons, again, are going to be at least one every platoon, and usually they will be heavy bolters. Though occasionally there will be things like Melta or Plasma, but those will again be much rarer than just bringing a normal heavy weapon. What is best about these Death Brigadiers is that they are entirely motorized, and a majority of them are equipped with the half-track or slightly armored vehicles. Quite a few N20s, but a few of those, for every one N20, there are 3 normal trucks going with them. So, one semi-armored carrier and then several unarmored carriers. But all 5,000 of them, are capable of rapid deployment and redeployment using their mechanized assets, mechanized and motorized. In addition to that, the Death Brigadiers have been given the largest artillery available to the group thus far. 100 tubed artillery, 132mm short guns. Now these are wall guns stripped from other hive worlds within the Carcharodon's cluster and also from certain areas that have already been taken over in the northern sector. These 132mm short guns are relatively easy to move. The mechanized forces of the Death Brigadiers literally bring them with them wherever they go, essentially as motorized artillery, so they deploy, and then the artillery immediately is right there to support them, and then when they need to retreat or they need to move, they hook it back up to their transport and continue to move. This keeps these 100 barrels effectively constantly in combat and able to engage lots of different enemies, but it even adds more teeth to the elite Death Brigadiers as a whole. In addition to that, we have 400 Luxatl. Now, Luxatl I have talked about on the channel before, but let's just go into them very briefly. They are essentially 8-foot long, massive, semi-aquatic lizards. They have flechette guns. Essentially, they shoot very, very high speed, either monomolecular or very sharp tusks or sections of steel. And these flechette blasters or flechette guns are activated with a neural link that goes into their brain and it allows them to climb or move on all fours while firing independently, fully automatic. These Luxatl are a mix. Some of them were allies to the Vahedwalk, born on their ships. However, Nadzabar went out of his way to cultivate a large clutch or brood of Luxatl on Gura itself, so a large number of these Luxatl are Guran in origin. Then, finishing off, we have 55 Dark Tusks. These are the Chaos Space Marines. Again, they are Black Legionaries who worship Nurgle. 10 Terminators, while the rest of them are Assault Marines, with a mix of, essentially, some heavy weapons, mostly melee weapons and bolters, though. Not a ton of special weapons for the Dark Tusks. The Terminators, however, have mostly Storm Bolters with quite a few heavy weapons. At least 3 of them are armed with either heavy bolters or combined grenade launchers of various types, and many of them have heavy melee weapons like Chain Fists or Power Fists. In addition to all of that, there are 200,000 standard Vahedwalk cultists. Again, these are Rushak Vakim's boys mixed with the Gutta Thraka, the Thorns of Heavens, Enoch's boys. Not Enoch. Whoops, my bad. Not Enoch, but, yeah. So it's the Vahedwalk and Nokad. Enoch, Nokad, gonna get the names mixed up, but yeah. The Vahedwalk and the Gutta Thraka cultists, there's about 200,000 of them. They are cheap, they have poor leadership, they are armed with shotguns and rifles. They really don't hold a candle to the Paxsuns in a lot of ways. Paxsuns are very well trained, they're very well equipped, they're quite well organized, and they have a very robust officerial corps. The Vahedwalk and the Gutta Thraka cultists are much more of a mass deployment. They're flesh, for lack of a better term, and they're going to be used to buffer a lot of other units. In addition to this, the entire fleet as a whole, whether it be in theater or coming into theater through the various naval ships that the Chaos Forces have access to, just beginning this fight as an ambush, they will have a significant amount of air support assets right off the bat. They will take the actual spaceport, obviously immediately as they've landed within it, and this will give them the ability to launch lots of aircraft in their incoming assault. However, there is one other, much more problematic deployment that Enoch has chosen for this campaign, and that is 20 Kimura. Now, this is way beyond the Death Brigadiers in terms of eliteness. This is a full-on illegal and highly dangerous deployment. Enoch Inokenti is gonna have words with Nadzabar, because these are troops that the Imperials are not supposed to know exist yet. The Kimura are a pet project of Nadzabar's. They are a process by which he can attempt to create possessed without possessing a person. It's a very complicated process. It combines a lot of Xenos technology, chaos theology, worship, and bargaining with various factions, but he has managed to produce a limited quantity of Kimura over the years. 20 of them all deploying together is beyond unorthodox. In general, the Kimura's biggest asset is the fact that they are master infiltrators. They are essentially completely invisible, not physically invisible, but unable to be detected by the Imperials. They give off nothing chaotic about them whatsoever. They look like completely normal people until they don't want to anymore. They are shape changers, they are shapeshifters, and the best reference would be someone who is a werewolf. They are genuine werewolves who can, at the drop of a hat, change from normal, completely uncorrupting, completely unmutated Imperial civilian into horrifying possessed monster, custom built for whatever type of combat they are designed for. And what is way, way, way worse than just them being able to change at the drop of a hat and pass as Imperial the rest of the time, is the fact that they don't lose their minds during this process. In fact, they are both completely lucid, and they retain the ability to use weaponry. So you go from a regular person pretending to be a PDF trooper to a werewolf with hands who can shoot a rifle and yet also has the abilities of a possessed individual and is completely sane. They are a horrifying infiltrator, and thus, the few times that they've been used in the campaign so far, in the crusade that Nadzabar's orchestrated, they've been used in individual groups of 1 or 2 as deep, deep plant infiltrators. However, Enoch has essentially said, fuck it, if I'm going to bring every single thing that I have to hammer down on the Imperials in the Cabal Group, I'm going to bring the most elite force that I can possibly have. And for that reason, he has elected to use the Kimura in this deployment, and we will see. They are brutal, violent, deadly, and they have killed Marines before, so this is not a new thing for them. Factions, leaders, and backstory. So, I've already gone over it a little bit. We have the Vahedwak with Rushak Vakim. I refer to him as the Lightning Lord. He's that ex-Imperial officer. We have the Gutta Thraka, who are buddies of the Dark Tusks warband, led by Ratten Moros, Dirge, and the leader of the Gutta Thraka, or the Thorns of Heaven, who is Enoch Inokenti. We have the Blood Pact, obviously, led by myself, Arkan Nadzabar, and standing in for me in this actual campaign, we have Enoch Inokenti. He is kind of a backline lieutenant. He's definitely not a front guy, and he's been tasked with this job as an extension of his job of protecting the Sanguinary Worlds, our homeworld. Then we have the Xenos Auxiliaries, as mentioned, the Luxaddle, and the various Life Wards. So, Life Wards are a little bit like the Kimura. They are a specially modified or mutated human, who is psychically dominated to a master or leader. This is a mix of things. Some of them are beastmen who are just incredibly, insanely loyal to one of the magisters, and they remain as a bodyguard for life, and they will gladly give their lives. They usually use enchanted or ensorcelled weapons of some kind, and they have various mutations or gifts that we'll get into later. However, there is something else, of course. These are just the forces secreted aboard, what we'll have access to during this first episode or first fight. There is something else coming. In addition to that false rogue trader Ambition-class cruiser, there's an incoming Chaos fleet. And the primary asset of this incoming Chaos fleet is my flagship, the Incarnadine. The Incarnadine, or the Incarnadine, is fresh to the fight. It has not yet been seen by any Imperial force in the entire crusade thus far, because it's freshly been in transit from Kilgrave. Kilgrave, captured only a short time previously, has rendered up several different very important ships, including the Incarnadine. Now, the Incarnadine is to be my flagship, and it is one hell of a flagship. It is a genuine Apocalypse-class battleship. Nova cannon, lances, various other flexible weaponry, and it is one of the largest capital ships that the entirety of the Jeu Sanguinary have access to. It's not the only capital ship, but it is one of the largest, and it will be coming in with that incoming Chaos fleet. In addition to that, we have the Fetid Ossa, the Rotting Bone, which is the Hellbringer light cruiser that is the flagship of the Dark Tusks warband. Then we have from the Gutta Thraka and from the Vahedwak an escort carrier, 4 armed merchant ships, a Falchion escort, a Siluria light cruiser, a Defiant light cruiser, and a demonic escort vessel, which we'll get into in the next episode. I know the naval fight's going to be fun, but it'll be a little bit more complicated and detailed for me to mete out. So, all of that initial group, the Ambition class cruiser, the Sword class escort, in addition to all of those other ships, led by the Incarnadine, which is an Apocalypse class battleship. What is the overall plan then? The forces are set, the troops are on the ground. Well, the siege is completed, we've cut them off, we've stuck them in the Cabal Group, now we have to move on to an active incursion. We need to divide them and starve out the fortresses, taking everything and setting up our own castle within the Cabal Group. Now you might be asking, how are these other ships getting into the sector if it takes so much deception for the initial group of Chaos Forces to get in? Well, they brought with them a bit of a beacon. Essentially, once those ships are in place above Enothis, they will let out a psychic marker, a psychic scream, so to speak. And this has been carefully coordinated with that incoming Chaos fleet to effectively make it so that they can jump into the Cabal sector, but before they enter any real combat with its defenders, they make another emergency warp jump immediately and follow that scream to be right above Enothis. Now that's going to take roughly 24 to 48 hours, but it will be enough time for the Foothold group, this secreted aboard group, to make their play. So what is their play? The Gates of Fire open. It begins basically upon their landing at 9 a.m. to first light on the next day, when the Chaos Fleet, the rest of it, shows up to reinforce and essentially solidify the control over the planet's airspace. As mentioned, the forces are about 256,000 mixed Vehedwak, Guthathraka, Blood-Pact, and Dark Tusk troops, against about 75 or 70 White Scars and 30,000 Enforcers. Pretty lopsided odds. The engagements are as follows. The conquest of the Space Force and of the spaceport is pretty much instantaneous. The freighter ships fall open, and the Blood Pact simply fall upon the Enforcers and the workers who are within. It is not a fight. You have very well-armed, highly disciplined, armored troops facing off against men with pistols, the occasional shotgun, and cheap melee weapons. It is a slaughter. The spaceport is closed down fairly quickly, and all of the ships and all of the equipment within is immediately grabbed and taken by a mix of Blood Pact and Vehedwak troops. This gives them their initial foothold, but of course the Blood Pact and the Chaos Forces of the Joe Sanguinary are not well known for staying in place. They begin immediately to push out of the spaceport in multiple different directions. By about noon, this rapid infiltration force has come into contact with all different types of nightmarish shit. They go for 2 locations. They need to take these in order to effectively maintain and solidify control over the entirety of Enothopolis as a city, or rather as a hive city. They need to take the Spire, aka the central command and control node for the entirety of the hive, and then they need to take down the orbital weapons so that the planet is less easily defended from orbital fire. Essentially, they can force them into surrender or retreat by using orbital weapons to destroy any Imperials that come by, and of course to prevent their orbital weapons from targeting Chaos vessels. These rapid infiltration forces meet what you would expect. It's essentially the White Scars coming down at incredible speed. They're slashing their way past streets. This is a hive. They are getting long sight lines on occasion, but a majority of the time they're going street to street and fighting squads of mixed Pact, Vehedwak, and Guthathraka troops. However, they are ridiculously outnumbered. For every squad of White Scars, there are tens of thousands of well-armed, organized, and driven cultists. And, though every single time the White Scars seem to come out pretty much on top of things, and the cultists are fleeing in various directions, they seem to keep channeling towards their target. Very similarly to how it's going in space, or how it's been going with the Crusade so far, each time that the White Scars manage to behead an assault group, or break or smash through some sort of aggressive movement, they discover that 2 or 3 other groups have
leapfrogged around them, found a bypass, gone through another area, or flown over them in order to get towards their original target. Eventually, the White Scars are forced to pull back. The main positions that they take up are one of the sections across from the main spire, and then, of course, the spire itself. There are some troops stationed within the orbital weapons positions, but the Enforcers are essentially unable to hold a majority of these spots. They're relying very heavily on the White Scars, and the White Scars are basically haven't lost many men before the actual night fighting starts. So, as the day goes, the only real losses go to the Vahedwalk and the Blood Pact, and yet they keep gaining ground. This force is simply far too numerically large for the White Scars to effectively behead every single incoming troop before it can get to its correct position. What is even worse, this leapfrog tactic is allowing these troops to get to positions that the White Scars do not know about, and they are routing various other groups of enforcers before they can get a chance to join up with the main spearheads of the defense. In addition to that, these are White Scars of the 8th Company. A lot of their troops are jump troops and or bikers, and their heavy assets are basically limited to aircraft, which are dueling with large numbers of Chaos aircraft in the upper atmosphere at the moment, while orbital fire essentially tries to blow the Ambition-class cruiser out of the sky. Now, that's not to say that the Space War is going entirely well, but it does mean that the aircraft from the Chaos Forces are able to tie up the Space Marine flyers, at least until nightfall, where a little bit of a shift happens. Now, by the time of night fighting, a lot of things have changed. Large portions of the Hive have fallen completely under Chaos control very, very rapidly. The numbers are not in the favor of the Enforcers. Most of them are dead, and the population is completely shut down. Many of them are fleeing, running away from the city entirely. Some of them are getting onto boats and simply going out into the ocean around the Hive's skirts. Others are taking up arms, seeing that the Marines are being beaten back, and, matter of fact, several Marine bodies are actually hauled back to the spaceport and then strung up on the walls for propaganda reasons. Seeing this, many of the Imperials are actually willingly taking up arms to try and kill the Enforcers. Most of them are not successful, but they are at least trying, and it's creating even more chaos. The bloodletting, as mentioned, goes right into the night, and two specific individuals get what is to be the most important engagements of this conflict going. The first is Sagittar Slaith. Now, Slaith is a slimy motherfucker. He is unbelievably backstabby. However, he is also a very talented commander, specializing in his stealth and in underground operations. He has managed to work and or backstab his way all the way to the top of the hierarchy for this group of Death Brigadiers. So he is in charge of the Death Brigade. He is a full-on Itagower in terms of rank, which puts him somewhere around the rank of an Imperial Colonel. And with his Death Brigadiers, he's elected not to take his troops into the streets, but rather use their particular specialty and their ability to gun down any small element of Marines or Enforcers that try to assault or entrap them, and he's taken them underground. Slaith spends the entirety of the morning, essentially 6 or so hours, going from the underside of the spaceport through the Underhive and making it to the base of the spire. At which point, he organizes an actual attack up into the spire with the Death Brigade and with several other troops that join him there. Now, he is far away from what you consider the front line of this combat, but the ability that he has to go completely unnoticed by essentially executing anyone who sees him within the Underhive gives him the ability to get this far ahead of, and in some cases behind, the front lines of the Enforcers and the White Scars. Not to mention that the White Scars are running around like chickens with their heads cut off, trying to deal with every single little bit of Blood Pact and Vahedwalk troop that manages to make it through. What is even more problematic is that each of these groups that they seem to keep obliterating are often becoming more and more studded with Dark Tusk Space Marines. And this is what really draws the big problem and opens up a space for our next character. The Dark Tusks engage very sparingly. They know that they are outnumbered by the White Scars, and to some degree, with the White Scars having so many vehicles and jump troops, they are also outmatched in terms of firepower and logistics. So, they are engaging sparingly. They are essentially completely insulating themselves with Gutta Thraka cultists and keeping themselves to the rear of engagements. However, they are acting as a effective backstop. 10 Terminators and a whole bunch of Assault Marines means that every time a run of bikes or a group of aircraft or airborne Marines come through and try and massacre the cultists, they run into this hardened knot of Dark Tusks that, after a couple of engagements, quite effectively cost the Marines several of their own number. This results in a considerable reticence in engaging with the Gutta Thraka if the Dark Tusks are there. So, in a way, their mere presence is slightly affecting the pitch of the battle. And this also causes the aircraft to begin targeting them much more effectively, drawing off the focus of the Space Marine Thunderhawks and Flyers from the civilian aircraft that are now flooding out of the spaceport. Now, within these civilian aircraft are a particular individual, Mabon Etikaur. Now, Mabon is another individual who has a lot of lore behind him and a great deal of theories involved within him, but we don't really see much of him until later in the Gaunt's Ghost series. However, he does start his life or his campaign against the Imperium right here. Mabon, or Mabon, depending on how you pronounce it, is a Kimura. He is one of those 20 modified individuals who have been sent to, well, particularly infiltrate an area. He and his fellows have taken several civilian transports and are flying them at low level towards the orbital weapons platform. And that's his target, essentially to take out this area, while Slaith makes his daring attack upon the spire. The result of this is two very unique engagements, or rather 3 unique engagements. The storming of the Enothopolis spire. This is a mix of forces. The Death Brigade, as previously mentioned, have lost very few men. They've traveled through the Underhive very quickly. They've killed off almost everything that they've come into contact with. They have not come into contact with any Marines as of yet. That's about to change. But they've lost almost no one, which is to be expected. They're heavily armed, armored, and incredibly well trained. In addition, they have brought the Luxatl with them. The Luxatl have a particular advantage, especially in this area. They don't have incredibly good eyesight, but what they do have is the ability to smell and identify things via taste in the air. And in addition to that, they can also climb up concrete, meaning that they are essentially flooding over the Underhive and helping to kill off any stragglers or any observers who are standing on or around buildings. This means that if you're not getting killed by the Death Brigade in the street, the Luxatl are murdering you in your bed. And finally, there is a breakthrough involved in this. The Dark Tusks are effectively going to attempt an aggression upon the spire from the street level. With the Death Brigade and the Luxatl pushing their way through the Underhive entrance to the spire, the Dark Tusks use the flood and the street battles on the Upper Hive to bring the Vahedwalk and the Blood Pact into contact with the lower spire, hopefully joining up with the Death Brigadiers and then managing to take over the spire in its entirety. Now, there is one more, which is the orbital weapons platform infiltration, but we'll talk about that in just a minute, because the Kimura deserve their own slide. But here's how it shakes out in the end. By first light on the next day, the White Scars have been overwhelmed. They have lost over 25 of their brothers in just a couple of hours, less than a whole day. Thousands of enforcers have died. Tens of thousands of enforcers have died. They've been used to hold static positions with pistols and shotguns and simply got rolled over by men with automatic rifles and body armor. What is even worse is many of them were told to counterattack or attempt to aggress upon areas where Chaos Space Marines or various other elite forces were being developed. The only ones who really survive are the ones who try and hold the spire. The rest are simply wiped out almost to a man, not for lack of wanting to flee, but rather for having been overwhelmed by a mix of their own civilians and superior enemy fire. However, the only actual engagement that doesn't go the way of the Blood Pact is that attack upon the Enothopolis spire. The end of the battle shows that the White Scars, for all of their losses, and the Enforcers, for all of their gutting losses, were able to hold onto the spire. The Death Brigade used their artillery to blast into and break into the walls of the lower spire, but this causes a bit of a problem. The rubble, and in fact the instability of the lower spire and the underhive, cause some cave-ins and a little bit of a mini hivequake as 100 plus tubes of 132 millimeter artillery blast into meters and meters of reinforced concrete. This chaos and a large amount of dust prevent the Death Brigadiers from really getting too far into the spire before they are met by a large number, basically 30 plus, White Scar Space Marines holding various entry points and choke points within the spire itself. This does, however, pull them off the street, and it marks the end of their offensive actions as they are rapidly pulled back in what could genuinely be considered disorder. Not only was this a genuine ambush, an unexpected event, but also, as you'll see on the next slide, they are missing their leadership for a particular reason. Now, this engagement in the Underhive, this Undercroft fight between the Death Brigadiers on one side, the Lux Saddle, and then on the street level, the Dark Tusks and the rest of the forces, goes poorly for basically everyone involved. The White Scars simply cannot get a break. They're getting constantly hounded, the spire is completely surrounded, and they're being blasted down from multiple now developed and continually developing points within the hive itself. Their blood-packed troops are setting up defensive works, they're emplacing weapons. Once the Death Brigadiers give up on trying to take the Undercroft, they smash in the ceiling in several locations to fill up the entire area with rubble, and then proceed to retreat in order to continue their siege of the spire itself. That means that essentially once the White Scars finally retreat to try and protect the spire at the very last, they can't really effectively aggress upon the enemy anymore, at least not today. And the only thing that gives left to them is one of the hive walls at the very rear of the spire, essentially the one on the opposite side of the spaceport, the one that was furthest away from the enemy troops, because it is simply too far away for them to easily drive or run before any engagement had to be done at the spire. And of course they hold the spire itself at the end of the day. So they have had many losses, but it is decidedly a packed and chaos victory. The Show Sanguinary have shown that through a mix of combined arms, incredibly violent tactics, and subterfuge, they can overwhelm basically almost an entire company's worth of Space Marines and send them packing in less than 24 hours. Urban combat being a particular danger to these types of Marines. However, something even more difficult has occurred for the White Scars. Their company captain, Vorga Khan, was deployed at the Orbital Defense Battery. Now he is a company captain, a well-developed and extreme veteran of many, many different battles. And, basically upon the instant, or upon the noon at which this conflict really breaks out, he begins his movement to try and take out and organize his troops in the best possible way that he can think of. Now, initially, this is exactly what I described, breaking off the different spearheads, trying to decapitate any aggression, and contain and essentially hedge in the Chaos forces. Even seeing that this isn't necessarily working, he chooses to change tactics, wants to go on a full offensive. He moves himself down from his control room in the Orbital Defense Battery, and takes his 5-man jump squad down to the ground floor in order to reposition. As he is going, quickly walking through the hallways, trying to look both imposing and also hurrying at the same time, he passes a group of about 20 local enforcers, quickly hurrying out of an adjoining hallway from the lower floor. Brother Captain thinks nothing of it, neither does the rest of his 5-Marine squad, and just as they're passing, he turns his head one more time. He notices something. He notices that they are armed significantly differently than the locals, and as he kind of takes a quick double take, he full-on turns his head, and he realizes they're not human. Now, what Vorga Khan sees in that split second, that instant when 20 Kimura turn and shift, nobody will truly know, as unfortunately he's not around to tell us. The Brother Captain reaches for his power sword, his two-handed power sword, pulls it about halfway out of the sheath, before Mabon Ettigower shoves a power sword right through the center of his Vox grill. Mabon had been seeing the Marines on his own auspex and had been prepping his Enforcer squad, the transformed Kimura who had stolen local Enforcers' uniforms. He had been preparing for them to have to do combat with them. Seeing the Marines simply walk past, well, he knew exactly what he had to do. He runs past the captain and puts his hand on his power sword. Once the captain turns his head, instantaneous twist, change, and brings the power sword right through the Marine's Vox grill, lopping off the top of the White Scar's head. That puts down Vorga Khan instantaneously. A low blow, to be sure, and definitely a sneak attack, but one that at least stunned the rest of the squad for long enough for the Kimura to do their work. They are 20 of them. Mabon has a power sword and a plasma pistol. The rest of them are equipped with hell guns and other power or heavy chain weapons. Their transformation is also unique. They are not Gen 1 Kimura. They are a little bit different. Or sorry, they are Gen 1 Kimura. They are not the different ones that we will see later. The Kimura are unique not just for their unnatural strength, their unnatural reaction speed, and their incredible ability to transform themselves, but they also have uniqueness. They have customization. The process that creates the Kimura, or really the process that modifies their bodies into the chosen form, is editable. It can change. And the form that these Kimura are in is one that I refer to as the kinetic protection form. It is a form that, much like the picture here, takes on a humanoid role, very much not abnormal from any other force. They do have some body armor on, but underneath that body armor is their real protection. The Kimura's real protection in this form comes from their skin. It is a heavy, multi-plated, chitinous armor, and this armor is basically entirely bulletproof. There are great descriptions, or at least one description, of the Kimura tanking multiple autogun hits to the chest, arms, and shoulders with absolutely no damage to themselves. This heavy, bug-like carapace armor being practically bulletproof up to rifle calibers. Now, in this close combat, with the Kimura having the absolute drop on 5, or rather 6, now 5 Astartes, they have an unbelievable first strike capability. The Astartes are drawing weapons and drawing beads on the Kimura when they fall upon them. Many of the Kimura simply scrabble on top of the Marines, going to try and grab arms or legs and locking themselves in position so that their allies can jam in power swords or chain weapons into the guts and into the arms of the Marines in order to effectively crack them open. It is quite disturbing how this slaughter goes very quickly from a surprise encounter to an absolute bloodbath. The Kimura are not without their losses. 1 or 2 of them are stomped to death by the Astartes and then slashed apart, but it is very notable that not only are these creatures incredibly tough and incredibly strong, they also have significant abilities to regenerate from wounds. A chainsword slash to the chest that rips their guts open is not going to put them down at all. They get right back up and they come right back into the fight, neon yellow eyes and neon yellow blood spraying all over the room. And the slaughter of Vorga Khan is very indicative of what happens to the rest of his squad. This jump squad, enclosed within a small area, forced to use their chain swords against, in some cases, completely superior weapons like power swords, they are at a significant disadvantage. What is also even worse is they find that their bolt pistols are of limited usefulness against the kinetically and also heavily armored Kimura. The Kimura are effectively able to tank not direct hits from the bolt weapons, but indirect hits seem to glance and smack off their bodies in a way that they wouldn't if they were made out of flesh. These inhuman creatures then proceed to completely eviscerate the entirety of the squad. Again, they lose 3, 1 dying of his injuries, having an arm and leg completely ripped from his body. 2 others lose heads or torsos in the engagement, so we're down to 17 Kimura, but these 6 Marines are decidedly deceased. And with them gone, there is no other force that can effectively hold off the Kimura, and the orbital weapons platforms are now in the hands of Chaos forces. And what a great job they do with them. The forces of the Blood Pact begin bombarding with artillery the bottom of the spire. The anti-aircraft defenses attached to the orbital weapons and the spaceport are activated to try and drive the Astartes out of the airspace. And of course, the orbital weapons themselves begin firing on the Astartes vessels in orbit. Finally, as the foothold really manages its job and the first light of the next day dawns, the Chaos Fleet appears above the planet. The Hive's and its defenders reorganize, trying to hold on to the central spire and the Hive's southern wall. Reinforcements and the alarm rapidly spread as orbital war and reinforcements from the Chaos Forces arrive. Using the orbiting Ambition-class cruiser as a beacon, they jump from the outer edge of the Cabal sector directly to Enothis, bypassing the orbital defenses and Vandamar, but they do set off the fleet's alarms. There is no longer any stealth involved. A massive Chaos fleet just showed up for a fraction of a minute and then disappeared again right in front of everybody. So they know what's going on, and due to the fact that the Spire was not taken, the Astropath begins informing the rest of the Cabal sector what exactly is going on this planet. So absolute chaos and pandemonium has broken out, everybody is panicking, and the chaos is glorious. The overall battle has been a resounding blood-packed victory through ambush. It's really not unlike many of those carried out so far in the campaign on a dozen or more different worlds. Thousands have died in the fighting, but it's a decided chaos victory by the next morning. They hold more territory, they hold more ground, and with the spaceport and the orbital war likely going in their way, they will be more and more of them to be reinforced. As a result of that, the local defense flotilla of 3 Marine light cruisers and 5 Marine escorts face off against Enoch and Nokad's combined Chaos fleet of, again, the Incarnadine, the Fetid Ossa, 4 armed merchantmen, 2 cruisers, 3 escorts, one of which is possessed, and they are about half strength in terms of friendly orbital weapons cover. So things are not looking great. However, what happens next is up to you. The vote will come out. Again, there are some limited options, but more so I want to see your comments on the alternative votes. I've introduced a lot of things. I know this is a long video. I kind of expected it. I knew it was going to happen, but it's going to happen. I'm going to say things wrong. I'm going to mess things up. That's just how it is with these videos. These are long. They're difficult. I take a really long time. It's been 4 days. I spent a long time writing this one. I have more stuff coming. But yes, your votes, very important. Your decisions, your comments, any questions that you have. Again, every single piece of this, don't just assume that I'm running off at the mouth. I'm showing zero favoritism. I'm trying my absolute best to make this as close to real life as we can get. And I'm trying to get it as close to 40k canon as I can get. So believe me, I'm filling in as many blanks as I can. Ask plenty of questions. More things will be explained to you later. Lots of details will come in future, and I will explain any aspect of this that you would like later. But believe me, this is as good a narrative as I can possibly produce. But with that being said, I want to say thank you to Jacob Cochter, who is our main page. He's our thumbnail. And then credit for my commission from Moritz Bludau. Moritz, love him, great artist, did all of my Nadzabar art. Jamie Martinez, Wolfric Hilston, Andre Wallen, Dave Kendall, Brother Cassius, Sterling Little, Kurt Ian Ferrer, and several other artists. But I had a lot of extra art for this one, which I love. I really like having a chance to give credit and provide details to all these people in their really, really good art. But with that all said, I hope this wasn't too long. I know I kind of sped through certain sections, and a lot of details on this are going to be different from the specific details that we do in other battles. But again, I'll have more duels, I'll have more details, I'll have more back and forth where it's not just instantaneous death in a lot of cases, but this was essentially a perfect ambush, so unfortunate situation there for sure. Either way, I wish you all a lovely good night.